Ladies and gentlemen, the Public Works Committee will come to order. We have 4 items on the general agenda and 4 on the consent agenda. As usual, we'll take the consent agenda first and hear them as one motion unless any of these are requested for removal for individual discussion. Anything on consent agenda?
C2.
C2?
Chairman, if there's nothing further, I make a motion to approve the balance.
Okay.
All right. Moved and seconded. Do we need to go through the equipment for that? All right. Let's do that again. Somebody
Got it.
push the button. All right, here we go. Vote yes if you approve of the other consent agenda items. And that's unanimous, and we will go then to item C2, please, and that will be presented by Ms. McCullough, I believe. Correct.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. In May of this year, the Department of Transportation solicited firms to provide a streetscape plan for our downtown. As you know, the Legacy 2013 update adopted and recommends the policy to encourage designs that promote pedestrian-friendly streetscapes in downtown. The intent of the streetscape plan is actually to help us to develop a consistent streetscape plan throughout our downtown area. Through our solicitation process, 11 proposals were submitted. The selection committee consisted of staff from the Department of Transportation and Planning, which included our Transportation Planning Development Coordinator, a principal planner, and 2 project planners. After they evaluated the 11 proposals based upon the criteria of scope of work, experience, qualifications, citizen participation, local presence, and NWBE status, there were 3 firms that were finally interviewed based upon, I said 3 firms. Yes, 4 firms interviewed. Based upon the interviews, they consistently selected MIG as the recommended firm. What we have here is just a memo outlining the process which was followed in that selection process, the firms and their ratings, with the intent to bring a final item for recommendation to approve a scope and fee that we would negotiate with this firm.
Right.
Any questions?
Yes, remember.
Specifically in terms of trying to walk back, some of the streetscape and design conversations that we've been having around downtown, there's been several conversations, and so when looking at this, I wanted to make sure that this encompasses many of the conversations that we've been having around streetscapes downtown. Particularly, there have been some that have happened in and around the Business 40 conversations and improvements on certain streets such as Liberty and Main, and how streetscape and design can be dealt with along those corridors, as well as, and particularly in eastward portions of it, Liberty, Main, and the intersections at Liberty and MLK and others, and how streetscape can be integrated in improvements there to really enhance. And so my question was more specific, just to ensure that those type of things will be things considered within this or not. Yes, sir.
The streetscape study, which was completed by planning, incorporated all of those concepts, and so this was the next phase of a continuation of that study.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments?
What is the geographical area that this is going to encompass?
I know it incorporates downtown, and I may have to get you that
Okay,
information.
yeah, I'd just be
later,
curious to
please.
know, because bringing up Liberty, Main Street, obviously is of great interest to me.
I think it's
CBD.
Yeah, I think it's just Central
The
Business
CBD
District.
going
Yes.
south, basically south to Salem Parkway, is that
Yes,
where we're going?
I think so.
All right. I believe this is an information item, so it'll come back in the form of a proposed contract to finance it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
And we can share some of those other images we've had before, because I like some of those streetscape designs we've seen just around others that have done.
Do we get the one with Mr. Taylor walking down the path beside 40?
This will go through the typical stakeholder input process, right? I mean, the consultant will
Yes.
take into
definitely.
account.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
All right, very good, thank you. Let's go back then to the general agenda, and let's go to item G1, please.
Item G1, ordinance amending section 75-351G, 75-351K, 75-352H, 75-352I, and 75-352K of the City Code relating to city participation in drainage projects across private property.
All right, and this was developed in response to discussions that this committee has had previously, and I believe Mr. Huff is going to present this.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, as you mentioned, this was an item that the Public Works Committee took up at its August 15th meeting, where basically the committee wanted to change from the existing 70-30 that we have on our private property drainage assistance program right now to an 80-20 proposal. So what you have in front of you tonight for consideration would change the single-family and the multifamily provisions of that ordinance for property owners with equal to or less than the median value of a home within our municipal limits. Their cost share proportion would be turned from 70-30 to 80-20 with a cap of $35,000 per affected property owner. So in essence, goes from 70-30 to 80-20 with the cap staying the same. Also a provision in this text amendment, we have extended the payback provisions from the current 5 years to 10 years for the single family and multifamily sections. So that is what you have in front of you tonight for consideration. Be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Yeah.
All right, let me understand this properly, and I applaud the effort to try to make stormwater runoff problems more affordable, but basically the $35,000 is a cap that the city is willing to put in on any project. Is that correct?
That is a cap per affected property.
Per affected property, so there's a ceiling there. And so if you're dealing with basically a $35,000 cap at 70%, 70-30, means that the homeowner puts in 15 and the city puts in 35.
Yeah, it's 70-30 or 35,000, whichever.
Whichever is less, right? Whichever works. So in that kind of case, if a project exceeds $50,000 in work, that difference has to be made up by the homeowner.
Correct.
Right. So in the case of an 80-20 split, you're dealing with a $35,000 cap again. A homeowner would put in, what, $8,700, $750. The city would put in $35,000. I mean, if I'm doing, if my eighth grade math is correct, right, right.
Property,
so again, that comes up to a project that's $43,000. In other words, if the city's putting in 35, and that's 70% of the project, or 80% of the project, excuse me, and you're asking for 20% match from the residents would put in $8,700. So the total project cost then, if the total project exceeds $43,000 or $43,700, then that difference has to be made up by the resident.
once it exceeds that $35,000
Right.
cap.
I'm just the framework that we're talking about here. So we need to be real clear that if we set that 35,000 as an arbitrary amount, and it sounds great that they're going to cover, we're now going to cover an 80-20 split, but if these projects are running higher than $43,000, then, realistically, that homeowner is still going to be putting in a higher percentage than the 20%. Is that a fair statement?
That assumes if it's only affecting one property.
Well, even if you have collective, I mean, even in this case where we have 5-6 properties lined up, each of them are putting in a 80-20 split, right?
Right, but if the cost, Mr. Chair, but if the cost was $50,000 and you had a $35,000 cap per property, then that raises the actual.
But it prorates. Yeah, it prorates. So what I'm saying, if you have a stack of 5 properties and it's a $500,000 project or whatever it is, it's prorated among those 5 properties. The point that I'm making is You know, when you're dealing, the 70/30 really begins to lose effectiveness at $50,000 per unit. You know, and when you reduce that to an 80/20, the effectiveness begins to be less effective at 43,000.
Mr.
You're also,
Chairman,
you're also doubling the payback period here from 5
Well,
to
yeah,
10
there's
years.
no, there are other parts of this that are excellent.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to be clear about what the financial impact here is. I don't know what the average amount that is being required in these repairs, but if the average amount is exceeding 43,000, even with the 80/20 split, the homeowner is going to be putting in more than 20% of the project. And that ceiling is created by the 35,000 that we set as all that we're going to put in. If we said it's an 80/20 match regardless of what the project cost is, then, you know, that's really clear. But because we put a $35,000 ceiling on this thing, then if it ever exceeds, you know, if it exceeds 50,000 on the 70/30 split, then, you know, the ratio changes. And in this case, even on the 20/80 split, the ratio changes. Is that math correct? Can somebody check me on that? But I think that what I'm saying is that we need to be clear that on the cost of these projects, we need to be very careful. Because my gut feeling is that a lot of them are going to exceed $50,000 in repairs if they're significant enough. There's this one we're looking at, particularly that's driving this cost. And I don't know what our estimates are on this particular project, but I think we need to look fairly carefully at that. And I guess one thing this council can consider is whether the 35,000 is a reasonable cap, how long that's been in place, and whether it's relevant in today's market at all or not. But I would hate for that to be, you know, a deceptive issue that, we only pay 35,000 regardless, and everybody's saying, oh well, it's an 80/20 split, but you know, we're only going to pay this much. I'm sorry.
Mr. McGovern.
I understand Councilman Larson's statement, and if there's a willingness, which I'm not sure there is, to reevaluate the dollar amount, I think that's something to discuss. But at the end of the day, same thing if you go and purchase a new car and you have a 100,000-mile warranty, or 10-year or 100,000 miles, whichever one comes first. You know, if you drive 100,000 miles in 4 years, the warranty doesn't go 10 years. And so if we're saying 80/20 up to $35,000. So if you hit the $35,000 mark, then the 80% piece doesn't matter anymore because you've hit the $35,000 cap. And I think has to be clear in what's being stated, but I don't think it's misleading per se in the sense of that, because I think it makes sense if you have the cap. If the question then is $35,000 too low, is I think more of the question, but 70/30 up to whatever dollar amount I think makes sense.
One other comment, the question of whether 35 is still the appropriate ceiling for is quite reasonable, and we can get a report back on that. The reason we need to have a cap at some level, twofold. One is that we have limited funding in the stormwater reserves. We need to try to make it go as far as we can. We're already looking at another request to significantly raise the stormwater rates for the coming year just to meet things that we're already budgeting. And the second is that we have seen cases come in where the cost of the project would have been substantially higher than the total market value of the property, including the structure company. And without a cap, basically we could have been stuck in the position of paying $500,000 to enhance a $100,000 home. But,
I know Councilmember Taylor has something to say, but one last technical thing that I'd like to. First of all, I'm all for 80/20, and I'm all for extending the time period. I think those are positive things. I just want to be clear about what we're actually doing here in the real numbers. If you look at K, paragraph K, do you have that on your computer here by any chance? And if we look at, I think we just have a technical error here in the sense that it's referring to between pages, I guess page 1 and 2, where we were talking about median value home less than equal to median value. That category should be 20%, and we're listing it as 30% on page 2. That first line on page 2 in your computer, can you check that? I mean, we talk about if it's higher value, if it's a higher value house, it's a 70-30 split. If it's lower value median
I think
house.
it's correct. I think you're correct.
You're correct.
So you see the error there? So could we look at that? And then lastly, could somebody explain to me number I under H, where we have actually multiple families? Wait a minute. No, it's I, where you say if owners of property involved request improvements, but not everybody agrees. What does that actually mean? In the disposition of the property, I think there's some questions of assessments and the city taking over the project or something. I didn't really understand how that paragraph was addressed. If we don't have unanimous opinion on a street, and how then that's prorated.
Provision I is when the council decides to order down one of these projects.
Exactly, that
which has not really happened in the last 20 or so years, but it is a provision that's in the ordinance.
And explain exactly what that means to me, if you would, as to ordering down.
If the council decided that they wanted to require the project to be done and force the property owners to pay for its cost, and this is the mechanism by which you would do that.
And under that scenario, still there's a cost-sharing provision, right? That the residents still have to pay their percentage, and
I think they pay 100% under this scenario.
They pay 100%, and but we take possession under easements and acquisition.
I'll have to go back and read it again.
Yeah, I think
it's
there's
been a long time
because
since it's been used.
this is the case of when maybe you guys read this paragraph as well as I did, but I was a little unclear as to whether the city then assumes ownership of this waterworks system and what the city actually puts into it and what the residents end up paying for it.
So it does read that it's for 30% of the valuation.
It's still a ratio. It's still ratioed.
It's still a
But
ratio.
you have certain owners that do not participate, and it looks like we are taking possession of their property or some easement of which they're compensated for, and the cost of that compensation then is incorporated into the project cost. And so, again, in a situation that was dealing with which prompted this whole discussion, if we have property owners who choose not to participate, what is our recourse? And it looks like our recourse is some legal process in which we take possession of either an easement or the property, and the cost of doing that, along with the installation cost, which I assume if we take that possession, we now take a 30% part of the project in that lot as well, because it's now our property. It's how that's handled. I'm just trying to understand, if we don't have uniformity on a big project like this, where the expenses actually are. And it looks like the final disposition then is that it's no longer private ownership, but in fact becomes property. The whole project becomes property of the city at that point.
If the council ordered it down, that would be my interpretation.
Is that what the interpretation is? So, but the cost is still shared by the property owners.
Okay.
We would retain a permanent easement. We wouldn't own the property fee simple. For the pipe replacement or whatever took place, we would have a permanent easement on those improvements, but not own the property fee simple.
And we would pay for that easement.
The ordinance just goes into the cost sharing and how the city would retain, I guess.
Says the cost of the project shall include the cost of acquisition and condemnation.
Yeah.
Right,
So
so we pay for
percentages.
a portion of it. They would be dedicating the rest, if you will.
Of similar easements across property of non-requesting property owners. I'm sorry to belabor this point, but I'm trying to understand in a real application where we have multiple property owners, what is going to happen here. I love the 80-20. I love the extra longer
Well,
payment.
the answer to the question is nothing is going to happen because I've never known council to order one down.
Order to do this.
Correct.
So what we
Residual language that's been in place for a long time.
So what we would do is-
Council's never really used it.
if we don't have everybody participating, we'll do what we can, correct, Mr.
Correct.
Right.
Properties we can do it on.
And then lastly, is paragraph K redundant or a duplicate of paragraph G in this ordinance? Maybe that's
I think what we have is a single-family set of provisions, and then it transitions to a
The
multi-family
multifamily,
set
got
of
it.
provisions.
All right, thank you. I did not pick up on that. So you're saying I is there just because it's there and we're not going to ever use, we've never used it, you don't anticipate we're using it again?
Not unless something significantly changes with the attitude and the philosophy of the council.
Yeah. This is the only solution we have for a multi-family project, is that if they can't get total consensus on it, this is the only alternative that exists, really.
Multi-owner.
No, there's a provision, well, intrinsic in the 70/30/80/20, whatever you want to call the new ordinance, that if all the property owners don't agree, but one property owner or a number of property owners want to take responsibility for those who don't, all that the city cares about is that it receives its 20%. So it's not required that each property owner agree to pay. It's only required that each of them agree to provide access to the property and that the city receive the total 20% or 30%, whichever is applied.
So do we need this provision I at all here? If we're not,
It's a nuclear option.
yeah, I mean,
We may need it someday. I mean, it would be under pretty severe circumstances, I would think.
You could conceive of a situation in which, we might decide that a neighborhood is sufficiently threatened by a problem across entirely private property.
yeah, I'm all for that.
That we would exercise this when somebody was just kind of sitting on their back porch and saying, stay off my property.
To protect somebody downstream,
To
potentially.
protect,
Sure.
the
Well, we're going to hear that.
2 dozen
we're-
property owners downstream of that location.
All right.
Okay, Mr. Gary?
Just wanted to point out, Chairman Bessie and Councilmember Larson, we did look as staff at when we the language for 80/20, and we didn't recommend it, but the council may want to choose to do it for that language. Like if you look at 1G, where it talks about the 80% with a cap of 35, you could have a cap of 40,000, which in essence would still get you to a project limit of 50, which is what the limit is right now. If you wanted to have a different cap for the 80/20 versus the 70/30.
Hold that thought. I believe Mr. Taylor had for a motion.
First off, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Let me say to Councilmember Larson, I appreciate you digging into the details and coming up with the tough questions. So I don't think you were belaboring the hour. I think you were asking some tough questions that needed to be answered, so thank you for that. This particular item came to us because of the situation that happened on Casella Street. I think the staff did a good job of coming back with some options, and naturally that option will be the 80/20 rule, which also allows us to have the repayment period from 5 to 10 years. After running that by the community, they seem to be very supportive of it. As a policy change, there may be a need to come back to this committee and to this council and consider the cap. But I just like the room to be able to reevaluate that if an issue comes up. So I'm glad you brought that up. I don't think we're there, but if we do get there, and if we feel like we might get there, I think this committee is open to bringing it back and reevaluating the cap. So I'm glad you caught that. Overall, I mean, I'm going to move for approval. The community likes what we're doing here, and they seem to think that they might be able to partner with the state and possibly with the county to come up with the other 20%. But this city has taken a step forward to support not only this neighborhood, but neighborhoods across the community by changing the rule from 70/30 to 80/20 based on median value. So, Mr. Chairman, I move for approval.
And Mr. Taylor, does that include the technical correction Mr. Larson identified of the place where it continued to say 30, it should say 20? The motion.
On K, was that K?
Paragraph K, yeah.
Paragraph K.
Let me.
At the top of the next page
Paragraph
after
K.
paragraph K.
Top of the
That does include the amendment.
Okay, and is there a second? discussion then, and Mr. McIntosh.
I'll be the jerk and ask, what's it going to cost the city over the course of a year to go from current policy to new policy? What do we spend now, and what will we spend going forward with the change?
It's highly variable, but on average, we get 989 drainage calls per year. Roughly 50-50 are private property versus public property, i.e. right-of-way. Just throwing out some hypothetical, if 33% of those calls, those private property calls, had a qualifying condition and then had a average project price of $20,000, of that, assuming that all took the deal, there's a couple $100,000 difference between a 70-30 split and an 80-20 split per year, assuming all those variables took place. 163 calls, 100% participation, $20,000 average project cost, and then an 80-20 versus 70-30 breakdown. That is roughly what it would translate.
So you anticipated that question.
Yes, sir.
And that was worst case scenario, it's not.
That is worst case scenario, 100% participation, which we get 1 in 10 now. So that is your absolute customer base should this take effect.
And that water comes out of, that money comes out of the stormwater. Correct.
Correct.
And does, I'm assuming that will increase or decrease the amount of time that money is available to use. We'll have to reallocate more money in the future.
Yes.
Actually, we don't have recorded a second. Right? Oh, yes, all right, well, it wasn't showing on my screen. All right, further discussion.
Did you give me a figure that's the average cost of a project?
I said assuming the average cost. We get them above 20,000, below 20,000. What we did is take a sampling of the last 20 projects that we did and do a rough average. That's where I came up with that 20,000.
20,000 is the average. So right now,
of a sampling of the last 20 projects.
Do we have any idea what this particular project is going to cost to individual homeowners?
Cassell Street?
Yeah.
16 property owners, roughly $600,000, give or take.
Computer and the math on this. What?
37.5.
37.5. So the 80-20 falls comfortably within that range. So we don't need to put a ceiling at this point. We don't need to raise the ceiling for this particular project.
As estimated.
Yes, that's
As estimated, that's correct.
That's estimated.
600,000
Within the
figure.
range. Yeah. That's my question.
All right, if there's no further discussion, those in favor of this, when it appears on your screen, should vote yes. Opposed, no. Hi, here we go. And that's approved unanimously. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Larson.
In view of the stormwater funding of this particular project, I think it would be useful, particularly for me, to understand the revenues that are generated from that program and what the expenditures are, so we can sort of anticipate how that money is generated and where it goes. I think a lot of people pay on the water bill every couple months and pay the little $5, $10, whatever the category they fall in. But I don't think very many people understand exactly how that money is distributed. We learned something about it tonight, but I think it would be useful for us to have an accounting of that. And if we're going to have financial issues with it, we need to know that in advance. So a P&I sort of thing.
We were going to cover that in the next section.
The
Next item.
Next item, item 2.
Okay,
G2.
thank you.
All right, and that's the only item we have on
Quick
this evening's
response.
agenda. Mr. Taylor, you are excused for family responsibility.
Thank you.
Then let's move on to item G2, please.
Item G2, supplemental information on the stormwater management program.
Mr. Ruff, are you leading the way here?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, at the August 15th meeting of the Public Works Committee, information was requested on the average annual expenditures of the stormwater utility, as well as the private property drainage assistance program protocols for other medium and large municipalities in the state. So what you have in front of you outlines the average annual expenditures of the major components of the stormwater utility. As you're probably aware, basically we collect residential and non-residential fees for impervious surface area from the folks in the municipal limits. Average revenues from that stormwater utility range from $10.2 to $10.5 million annually. And what you see in front of you is basically a breakdown of the expenditures, the MPDS program, water quality, floodplain, etc. And these are numbers that have been based on the past couple years of expenditures and lumped together in the major components, as I mentioned. And after that, you have a table of what the other medium and large municipalities do as far as drainage assistance on private property. Charlotte, Durham, Greensboro, High Point, Raleigh, and Wilmington.
As far as their official policy.
Yes. Be happy to answer any questions.
Your total revenues, what, 10 million, 10.2?
Yeah, 10.2 to 10.5, and it's fluctuating with the decommissioning of impervious surface area, airport, Whitaker Park, etc.
Yeah, really.
So it's fluctuating.
And expenditures 12 million.
And this has a bond payment in it, so you'll see a more robust capital projects line item than you would in previous years, because obviously capital projects ramping up plus bond payments in that. So that's
so what is the cap? What would be some capital projects you would be doing?
Spring Park, Washington Park. We just finished 28th Street, which was a water, sewer, storm drainage infrastructure replacement. Things like that are typically slated on our capital CIP list. Lockland Park is one that's under construction as well.
So the line item for the capital project is $3 million. We can't sell bonds for those. We can't finance those.
We have sold bonds in the past. We issued debt 4 years ago, 5 years ago, $12 million. We are currently making bond payments on that debt that we issued. So we have in the past, yes, sir.
Other questions?
Is the street sweeping budget, the $750,000, is that our total expenditure on street sweeping, or is it supplementing other?
That's the
budget?
total contract.
Total budget is absorbed by this program?
Contracted service.
Contracted sweep.
All of that could change. Correct. Will change. So, according to this, Charlotte and Winston-Salem are the only cities that do what we do in terms of stormwater management as far as participation on private property. Is that what I'm reading?
They all have some type of program with the exception of one. Charlotte is the most robust, where they take on all drainage systems. And they are one that stepped out there above and beyond any other community. Thus, they have a backlog and a waiting
700
list
projects.
like no other.
For high and medium, yeah.
They also still require a 50/50 cost split with the private owners.
To advance the project into high priority status.
Okay.
But otherwise, if you're waiting on the status quo, it's by priority ranking. The AI, the A, the B, the C, etc.
Actually have your project built within the foreseeable lifetime.
Yes.
You got to pay half the cost, okay.
And so, after Charlotte, we're the second most comprehensive.
I think Durham and Greensboro have some fairly robust policies. Greensboro, for example, if there's public water on it, they will handle it. However, if it's something that doesn't have public water on it, they're not touching it. Raleigh's gone to an 85, I believe, for Raleigh. 8515 with a cap of $5,000 for each property owner. So they have a fairly robust program.
And are they funded by same kind of stormwater runoff? Are they taking that already?
Yes, sir. Councilmember Larson, most of these programs that we benchmark have a standalone stormwater utility, meaning they don't get their funding from tax base.
So can we see the rates of their stormwater runoff rates? We have prepared data somewhere.
Yeah,
What they're using to generate to pay for a 85-15 with a $5,000 cap, is aggressive.
I bet they're higher.
Yeah, you think?
Yes.
Really? Yeah, absolutely. So I'd be curious to know what the industry standard is for our equivalent cities if we look at this whole service. It's a very valuable service, and we do want to make sure everybody recognizes what they're getting for their money.
Reading the fine print, Raleigh has a 85-15 for structural flooding projects. They've got an 80-20 for severe erosion.
And as I understand, they have a pretty good backlog of projects as well.
How's our backlog?
We are holding steady with projects. We do a lot of estimating, a lot of contact with citizens, but like I say, maybe 1 in 10 reaches this committee for approval, if that. So we do a lot of estimating. There's a lot of discussion, but very few takers.
So we see every 80-20 that is approved? Is that? We haven't seen that many yet.
No. And they can come through on the consent agenda too. So.
They show up at this committee first.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, but they would show up possibly on our consent agenda unless it's pulled off. So,
Yeah, you might see 2 in 1 month and not see any in 6 months.
Other questions?
Well, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Very quick response to my request.
Thank you very much. All right, let's go then to item G3, please.
Item G3, information concerning mapping of the city's storm drainage system.
And I will have to say that when I tried to call up the map, it kept crashing. Overload. Wouldn't come through.
Mr. Chairman, the PDF map that was attached?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this was an item that the committee also wanted as part of its August 15th meeting, where they wanted a map of the storm drainage system within the municipal limits. As you're aware, we do map that as part of our NPDS permit. We have a mapping system that contains 42,154 structures. That's manholes, catch basins, inlets, etc., within our public right-of-way, and then 40,567 pipes. That excludes open channel and other types of conveyance. Basically, that is housed in the county's geodata in a GIS format, and we typically have not printed that out hard copy for those reasons, as it's very difficult to read. It would result in a map that's 200 feet by 200 feet. So what you have is a very poor attempt to try to characterize.
That's not hyperbole. We ran the numbers.
Absolutely. Yes, sir, we did.
We're going to put it on the field at Bowman Gray Stadium, right?
Good. Good.
So that tries to depict how many structures we have, which is totally illegible. And we apologize for that, but wanted to illustrate the extensiveness of the map. But you do have access to it via the link below via geodata.
So that's what it looks like on the website that the county has for if you want to look at a specific area.
And you can pull that up through GIS.
Correct.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions about this information?
I couldn't pull it up either, so I kept crashing. So I haven't had a chance to look at it. I think my real concern about this, as I've expressed before, is that homeowners may have pipes running through their property that they have no knowledge is there, and there's no mechanism within the deed process of showing through easements or anything else that these are hazards when they acquire a property. And if the property seller even knows it, apparently it's questionable. And so some somehow to the real estate agents. Maybe it's important, maybe it's not, but it's certainly important to a homeowner who's surprised one day to wake up and find a sinkhole in their yard and it's going to cost them $15,000 to fix it. So I don't know how we sort of begin to at least inform the public of this hazard, which is really what it is. We're certainly seeing it in other places now. And it may be just trying to get the word out that this is something that we map if it's accessible, and for real estate people to be able to actually confirm that, buyer beware. But it does seem to me to be something we ought to try to make the public aware of.
On a standard North Carolina real estate contract, when you're selling, you're required to fill out a form under penalty law that says that you either have knowledge or have no knowledge of this type of thing. So if a seller willingly misrepresents, there's a pretty significant penalty.
Yeah, I don't think people are fooling themselves. I think it's just lack of knowledge. These pipes are running through people's backyards.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's misrepresentation.
I think it's just that it's been going on for so long, and there's so many pipes out there, and they're in so many yards that there's a hazard out there in the urban environment, and people are realizing it, and they're realizing it too late, and there's no mechanism to warn them, apparently, seemingly, and I'm not sure where they go unless we provide some place and let realtors know, or let somebody know, that you can go onto a site and see if there are any utilities that are ripping through your property.
Yeah, we have information requests routinely from real estate agents and developers, surveyors, engineers wanting this information. We do direct them to the information, but we do it with the caveat of the limitations of this information. We ask them not to design from it, etc. But we do have routine calls from folks wanting to know if we've got information, and we'll ship it off to them readily.
I would assume that the older the structure, the older the development, the less information we're likely to have on the
Correct.
drainage system.
This information is geared around the city's NPDES permit and what we are required to hold in that geodatabase. And basically that is anything that is considered MS4 or municipal separate storm sewer system. And sometimes that doesn't pick up the smaller pipes, the smaller things that are coming off the private properties that are directly going into the creek that never touch the city right-of-way. Sometimes those are not picked up because it's not required by the statutes.
I'm not going to beat on this horse anymore. I would like to talk offline about how streets are laid out in the urban environment. I understand in today's modern housing development projects in suburbia, there's a review process, that involves all that. In the 19th century, and when this town was established, 1913, and merged, those streets that were put in place, those storm drains, those gutters that were put in place, how was that done? Public Works program, there was a Public Works committee, I understand, I believe, part of the municipal government that established roads and what have you within the city. And so this goes back to my basic question that I've been asking, is who put these pipes in and whose responsibility ultimately is to maintain? So we can go on forever, but I appreciate the data that you've prepared.
Okay, then let's go to item G4, please. This is
Item G4, Downtown Parking Analysis Infrastructure Improvement Project Presentation.
all right, thank you, and who will be handling?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the city hired the consulting firm of Kimberly Horn and Associates to do a downtown parking study for us. Fred Burchett is the vice president with the firm and will be doing the presentation along with his team.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Gentlemen, if you will introduce yourself for the public and present away.
Yes, sir. I'm Fred Burchett with Kimberly Horn Associates. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Good evening.
I understand you have a copy of this presentation, so I'm not going to belabor every slide, just try to hit some of the highlights. The study was conducted earlier this year. The objectives were look at the current parking inventory, look at what is our current usage of that inventory. We had a public participation process. We included an online survey, meetings with key stakeholders, public meetings. We developed a model to model parking demand, both existing and in the future that allows you to model future development to understand future parking demand. We've also looked at some costing and funding options. Existing conditions, I'll start with this is just the study area. There were the core study area, which is outlined in red, and then the overall study area, which is the blue area of downtown. We collected data on the weekend in the core area. We collected weekday data in the overall study area. We also collected weekday data in the core area. And just here is some of the, the areas. The light blue areas are where there's existing surface parking. The dark blue is on-street parking. The green are parking decks, and the shaded or the crosshatched are ones that are city-owned parking decks. So this is the existing kind of inventory of the parking. If you look, we see there are about 16,400 spaces in downtown. Typically when we do this number surprises people, but my big takeaway on this is what we tell cities is basically we encourage there to be a mix of public and private parking. But we encourage the city to have about 40% of the parking inventory. At 40%, you're able to have influence in pricing, and pricing matters within the city. And you can see here that you control about 23 or 31%. So you do not control enough of the inventory to have influence in parking pricing policies in the city. Here are some of the results. Color-coded, we call this a heat map. If the facility is less than 50%, it's dark green. If it's over 90%, it's shown as red. Anything over 90%, that's when people think the facility is full. Trying to find those last spaces is typically difficult. On a weekday, what jumps out at me is the preponderance of green and dark green on the off-street facilities, and how many on-street facilities are red. And I think as residents, you see this every day. The on-street is full, but there is a lot of supply in the off-street parking facilities in the city. That was a weekday. We collected data, and I'll just take a step back, both every hour of the day, on the hour, from like 9 o'clock to 6 o'clock. What we were showing you is the peak hour, but we have the other hours as well. We also did a Friday evening, and this is, again, the peak hour on the Friday evening. Same thing. The on-street is essentially fully occupied. The off-street is underutilized in the evenings and weekends. And here is the Saturday, the same pattern we're seeing. High demand for on-street, off-street's underutilized. Quickly, public participation. We did an online questionnaire. We had a number of one-on-one meetings with individuals throughout the city that were identified. And then we did a public meeting with some online polling. I'll just hit some of the highlights of this. For some of the key stakeholders we talked to, the feeling was there's adequate off-street parking for the existing demand. These are unfiltered comments, what we heard from the people we talked to. They don't think the garages are used because of cost, because of they're not user-friendly, they're not clean, and there are safety concerns and inconvenient to exit. And I will say most of these comments were oriented towards the privately owned garages. They are not the city-owned garages. And if we look at cost, I'll just bring it up now. The first hour in one of the private garages is $3.50 an hour. A lot of the on-street spaces are 25 cents an hour. So I think that's what the frame of reference is in cost. Other comments was inadequate wayfinding for public off-street parking. And what we heard from another people was the existing on-street parking system is confusing. They said in some areas there's a mixture of time limits, pay stations, meters. There's even different enforcement times. Church Street is enforced till 5 p.m., Chestnut until 6 p.m. So there's different policies that people found confusing. Again, comments they do not care for pay and display. This walking back to a vehicle is inconvenient. There are a lot of loading zones. They said could some be repurposed. Enforcement seems to be inconsistent. And then I understand this was done before some of your recent changes about ADA parking, but the feeling that we heard was inconsistent in terms of quantity, location, and configuration. Public meeting, again, the question was asked, will the existing parking supply be sufficient for all existing and known future developments? We can answer that question with a model. We were asked to identify potential locations for new parking decks, provide study examples on how to improve downtown parking, ways to improve decks to attract new parking, and then the need for implementation of wayfinding. Online survey, we had about 800 responses. When asked to use one word to describe downtown parking, and again, if you look at these, 45% of the people said they were residents or visitors. They said challenging, difficult, inadequate, and frustrating. Our observations are your on-street parking rates are just way too low. 25 cents per hour is the lowest rate I know of anywhere next to free. The private on-street rates were observed at $3.50 an hour. I think this is basic economics. If I'm coming downtown and I can choose to pay 25 cents an hour versus $3.50 an hour, I'm going to pay 25 cents. I'm going to take that on-street all day. And that's why you're over 90%. What we heard from some of the people we talked to and others was that the current, it may say it's enforced to 5 or 6, but in actuality it's really only enforced to about 4. One of the things we noticed is, particularly in the areas near restaurants, this is not a unique problem to Winston-Salem. Is the restaurant employees show up at 4 o'clock, they park on the street, and they're there the rest of the evening, preventing your downtown visitors from access to their spaces. So that's happening here, and that's what we saw in the data as well. Recommendations are, he said you need to increase on-street parking fee at pay stations to at least $1 an hour. What I recommend cities as a policy to price their on-street and off-street parking rates as a system. My favorite example in the state is the city of Asheville. The city of Asheville is $1.25 per hour if you park on street. It's $1 per hour if you park off street, with the first hour free. So what that does is that gives users of the system the ability to control their destiny and how much they're willing to pay for parking. If you want to come down for dinner, stay 2 hours, you're paying $2.50. If you're going to park in the garage, if you're first hour free, you may be paying $1. But that has helped balance their demand and push people in those garages, those people that want to save a little money. Our recommendation was to leave the existing rate for the off-street the same, but remove the daily max. I really would like a way, and I'm going to show you an example, to get this where we could have the on-street rate higher than the off-street, but again, you don't control enough of that inventory without some significant policy changes. We said implement enhanced payment options. What the research has found and what we've seen is people really don't mind paying for parking as long as it's convenient. But if you pull up and you've got to pay, $1.25 per hour, and you got to have 5 quarters, who has 5 quarters? But if it's a credit card, people will pay that all day. What we're seeing also with pay stations, people will typically max out the amount of time, and cities are actually seeing increases in revenue because people are paying for more time they need. We think there needs to be seeking some cooperation with the private providers of parking. How can we work as a partnership to maximize that resource of parking? What I want to do is here's an example, just if you kind of go back 10,000 feet and look at some of the different cities that we've worked in. The dark blue is metered parking, and the red line is where there's pay stations. The light blue is time-limited parking. Again, I'm talking about on-street right now. And then the yellow is kind of unrestricted parking. And then the daily rates is 25 cents to 50 cents an hour. And if you I'll bring this back, but to me, there's not a pattern to this parking as there are in other cities. For instance, here's Greensboro, and with the exception of Elm Street, which is free, there's this kind of center where there's metered parking, and then some of the outer line areas are time limited. And again, on-street rate is $1 an hour. Raleigh, again, you see the core there has metered parking without to unrestricted and then time limited in various places. Some of you obviously know that's the block around the Capitol building down there is all reserved for the General Assembly, so that's why it's permit parking there. It's $1 an hour, and then on Fayetteville Street, it's $1.25 an hour. Asheville, most of the street parking is metered, and you can they do not have pay stations, but they do allow pay by app for most of their downtown. There's very little unrestricted parking, as you can see. Again, the core, there's metered parking. As we move out, some of the areas are time limited. The on-street rate is $1.25 an hour. So the off-street rates here in Winston-Salem, they vary by location and time of day. The public facilities are $1 an hour. Trade and Liberty lot, 25 cents per half hour, 50% per hour. The private lot at the corner of Main and 3rd is $3.50 an hour. So this is a sharp contrast to the on-street rate. Some of the 10-hour meters are 10 cents. So it's a hodgepodge of rates. So what I'd like you to think about is how can we better manage parking demand with parking fees, the example I gave in Winston-Salem. The off-street parking facilities have available supply. And this is what I said earlier, decrease the off-street rates to where the fee is less than on-street rates to entice those people parking 1 to 3 hours to park off-street. Increase the on-street rate to make them aware of that subsidy. And then can we subsidize owners of the off-street parking assets to lower the parking fee? And I will tell you right now, this is a recommendation I've never made. I've never encountered a situation where the rates are this disparate. But to me, it makes some sense to try to figure out how we can tap into that supply that's sitting there underutilized. And I put together just a little cost analysis, and this is all hypothetical. It's all just for talking purposes. But if we said there were a need for 300 additional parking spaces in downtown, we said, okay, we want to build a new deck to meet that demand. That deck is going to cost you about $20,000 per space, plus 35% for soft costs, plus land. So we're in the neighborhood of $8.5 million for a new deck for 300 spaces. Debt service, just 3.5% for 30 years. Your debt is about $460,000. Your annual operating costs are about $250,000. So you're in the neighborhood of $700,000 a year. So what if we were to take those same 300 spaces, and we assume they turned over twice, and we offered a subsidy of $1 an hour to the owners of the private operator, private decks for 3 hours? The annual cost would be in the neighborhood of $450,000. So, like I said, this is just a theoretical cost. It's to say, how can we use that parking supply? How can we work together to use the parking supply that's here instead of building new? Also, what we've recommended is, typically people have enterprise funds for parking. Merge the on-street and off-street fund into one fund so we can manage parking as an overall system. Don't think about on-street and off-street. It's a system. It needs to be managed as such. When we were looking over the financial information, there are a lot of interdepartmental charges, where others, IT charges to parking, but there are a lot of other city departments that are using city parking, and there's no parking interdepartmental charge coming back to the parking fund by the other city departments. It seems like if it's going to be there, it needs to be both ways. And also, let's improve customer service by enhancing the web page and giving more online options for paying fines, applying for parking permits, and a lot of cities have almost a one-stop shop in their webpage for parking. So I've kind of blown through that quickly. I'm happy to take any questions, go back to any pages. So.
One question that had been forwarded to me by an interested stakeholder: why was there no formal future demand analysis included in this study?
We have the formal future, we have the analysis. We just in the last few weeks got some information to the city for projections of future developments they've asked us to model. So we have a model that we will be delivering to the city that you can do that type of model, type analysis, getting every development to get that.
All right, but that's only development specific, is that correct? That's only development specific, is that? So there was, I am not used to doing parking analysis, so I may not be asking the question properly, but I think that the question was, why was there not an overall analysis done of future demand?
Okay. To analyze future demand, we have to have some assumptions about future land use. Mm-hmm. What is going to be there? And we've got those from the city in the last few weeks. We're wrapping that up, and we can roll that in and into the final report. There will be those based on the assumptions staff has given us for future development. That will be projected future parking demand, much like the heat maps that we did for existing. We will prepare those for future demand.
All right, thank you. I have another question, but Ms. Montgomery, go ahead, please.
A staff question and then a question around some of the numbers. I know the focus of this examination is in the core of our downtown area. When we think about parking and within central downtown area, and I'm thinking of the newest update to the downtown plan of what that incorporates, which does incorporate part of community that is undergoing now through master planning process in terms of the East End area there. I'm just wondering in terms of, have we considered any of that in terms of demand for parking and how we have utilized parking decks, structured parking in the past around incentivizing development?
It's not something we've looked at recently, going back to the ancient history that I think we've talked about in the past on how the city got into building all the parking decks. It was basically to support new development. So I think as a new development comes along in those other areas, we would look at it as a request from the developer.
Okay. In reference to the 40% threshold that you mentioned in terms of that you suggest municipalities have control over in terms of influencing, how many additional parking spaces is that for us to have if we were to have control outside of that mechanism of subsidizing? How many more spaces would we need to hit a
How
30?
short are we?
Yeah.
Well, we said there's 16,000. So I'm doing chainsaw math in my head if that's all. So that would mean 40%, we would need about
6,400.
6,400.
That's right.
We have.
And how many were in the 2 decks we sold?
I don't know that question.
Okay.
650 in one and 500 in the other. The number, how many did you say, Fred?
6,400.
6,400 is, well, let's put it this way. The largest deck we have is 1,500 spaces.
All right. So I'm just saying, and it's my sentiment, we were having conversations around selling parking decks that I did not think it was a wise decision of the city to engage in such, which would challenge me very, very greatly to a degree of then turning back around and subsidizing decks that, I understand what you're saying, but from a standpoint of we just said we were selling a deck and then we turn around and we subsidize a deck that we sold. To me, that, to the public, I don't understand how you can say that that initial decision made sense. And it might be the right thing that we need to do in terms of how we control it, but how you suggest that that was a good decision, I don't know how you do that. But
Thank you for not asking me.
yeah,
But, I'm trying to not look in the past. I'm just saying there is a on-street problem today. They're not making any more on-street parking. How do we manage that problem going forward? We manage that problem by getting some of those people off the street into the decks. And we have a basic economic problem. It's supply-demand terms. Who among us is going to pay $3.50 now when we can park on the street for 25 cents?
Right.
So the only idea I came up with was this subsidy. And I agree with you, it's a hard sell. It would be a hard sell, I would think, also to say we're taking rates from 25 cents an hour to $1.25 an hour.
I don't have a problem with that. Yeah, if you want I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
If you want market forces to play, you drive the population into the parking decks with fees on the street that make that attractable. If and nobody wants to do that, but I mean, this is where we're sort of moving. You got limited parking. It's way subsidized right now at 25 cents an hour. You have parking decks at $3.50 an hour, both private and public.
Public are $1 an hour.
Or what?
The public decks are $1 an hour.
And okay, so how do we compete then? We have $1 an hour fee, and we have private sector at $3.50 an hour. Are they making money at $3.50?
Doors are still open.
Doors are still open. So the question is, if market forces are at play here, and they're making money at $3.50 an hour because they're filling their decks.
They're not filling it.
Well, there you go. So the question is, where are the forces to move people from one to another? If they're charging $3.50 and surviving at that, then I've got to sort of ask, what are the economics of the whole parking market that we're dealing with? And certainly, we all agree that the on-street parking is limited. It's a limited commodity, and it's the cheapest parking we've got. So, you've got to kind of look at that to start with.
Yes. And, I think, again, I think the on-street should be more expensive than the off-street. But the whole concept of raising it to above $3.50 an hour just, to me, felt like a non-starter.
Mr. McIntosh and then Mr. Montgomery.
I went back to the 2005 parking study that was done, and it was really interesting to hear the conversation then. And there was talk about sort of suppressing the amount of demand out there on Restaurant Row. The whole conversation was about Restaurant Row, and that was the focus because that was the only thing going on downtown. And because there wasn't enough on-street parking, it was hurting the merchants there. This has now shifted quite a bit. I mean, downtown has grown beyond Restaurant Row. To me, one of the biggest things, even more so than pricing, is understanding what's available and how much it costs. I pay a lot of $15 parking tickets because I end up without a quarter in my pocket and, slam the door when I leave the car because I know I'm going to get a $15 ticket because I can't, come back and change it. I drive up north quite a bit. I've got an easy pass. When I go through a toll booth at the speed limit, I don't know what it costs. I don't really care, and I think parking to some degree is the same way. If I know where a space is, if it costs me 25 cents, 50 cents, $1, it's not going to break me. And so I think their tools are emerging, and I think they're already out there. Wilmington and Asheville, I think, already use a cell phone model. To me, that gets rid of a lot of the frustration, and that's where we get hammered is on the frustration side. I can't find a space. Well, I know where the spaces are, and people who are downtown, the regulars know where the spaces are. It's the casual user that comes in that is unaware and gets mad and then tells her friends that there's no parking space downtown. So to me, solving that problem is the biggest issue, but then also forecasting for demand. We've added, a healthy downtown should be able to support 5% of your metro area population. If we were doing that here, we'd have 17,500 people living downtown. We're nowhere close to that, but theoretically, that's what we should be able to support. We've got 1,000 new units online, coming online, not even online yet. So to me, the demand study side of it is really important. Where are we going? Let's not choke off development because we don't have the parking available. And I think some of the deals that we've done and are doing that pay us back as we go along are good business because we're getting our money back. Straight up building a parking deck I think is a different, more difficult issue, but not necessarily out of the question.
Other questions or comments? Yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery.
In reference to, touching with Councilman McIntosh in reference to, the opportunities engagement around app and things of that nature. If I'm not mistaken, did we not have someone come to us a few years back in reference to parking application?
That's correct. We looked at the Asheville model. The difficulty we had at the time we evaluated it was the cost for the services the back-end service to do the billing was significant to us, but certainly something the city council could still consider for later on.
Our IT department is looking at it now.
But then, again, just overall, when we think about the parking piece, from a, from a price point standpoint, as has already been mentioned, I think we have to make some shifts in terms of where we are for on-street parking. I think it makes sense. I think some of these things are, again, a good issue to have now because of the growth and development that we've had in downtown. And I think when you look at a 25-cent on-street parking, that had been an incentive to and maintain at that price point to help get people into downtown and attract them into downtown. And right now, it's no longer the issue of wanting to get them into downtown, but now when they're there, making sure that they're in the right places. And so I don't know how these will end up into actual recommendations that will come back to a committee in some form on actual action items that we can take. But I think some of these are good recommendations for us to take a look at and low-hanging fruit when we begin to look at the questions of price point. But I wonder if there are opportunities to engage with some of the private owners for more collective conversations. I'm not mistaken, I think the partnership has had some conversations with folks. And then on the side, I go back to a question I think I've asked before. May have gotten information and may have missed it, but I go back to the parking deck at Embassy Suites in terms of the dollar amount investment, in terms of whether or not the folks have met their commitment to invest in that deck.
We'll check it again for you.
Mr. Brackett.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add to this was that the concern that's been brought up to me by several business owners downtown about their employees. If we're going to significantly increase the cost to a casual user, it's not that much, you're paying it every once in a while, but to somebody who's working downtown at a restaurant or a retail store day in, day out, it significantly impacts them. I think a smartphone app gives us the ability to have tiers and or consider some way of opening up our parking decks to them if they're underutilized now, and we could shift some of that, what is currently prime space there taken up on street, into one of our empty decks. And if we can find a mechanism to make that work, I think we should explore it.
Yeah, an incentive for using the decks, because clearly we have an enormous oversupply of space in the decks, quite frankly. And anyone who's in good health and not limited walking wise can easily walk from one of the decks that are in all three of your peak scenarios are less than 50% occupied to any of those restaurants downtown. But if it's not a financial hardship for the folks on the on the server dollar wages, for example. So that's the question. Yes, sir.
The Asheville model, they have a contract up from the department level, and you can pay by app or pay by smartphone. The transaction charge is 25 cents per transaction. That's passed on to the user. So if the user is paying by app for $2 for 2 hours of parking, they give it for $2.50 plus a 25-cent transaction charge. So that's how that transaction is. City's not bearing any of that. It's all being paid by the user. The other thing you were talking about control, I think we're in a really interesting time in parking and changes in technology. You have some of the pay stations here. Pay stations are on the way out. I think in the next probably 10 years, you will see all pay by app. But pay stations provide a great opportunity as an interim step to get people used to paying with credit card, used to technology. I'm not aware of a city in the country right now that's said we're going straight from meters to pay by app. That's a big shift. But it's going to happen. I just have not come across a city yet that's done.
Okay. Comments, questions? Yes.
Has there been any instances where, I know the cities have had apps and may pass off costs, but where we've contracted with a private firm to provide that service? And I'm just thinking, is there a private company that may be able to provide that service? In terms of the application?
Oh, yeah, again, Asheville, when they contracted with Park Mobile came in and just placed a sticker on the parking meters and said, we're taking care of everything. Now, they gave the city a back end to tell them where to do enforcement. So they know which meters are occupied and which meters are vacant. They can actually pull it up on their smartphones, and that is all provided by Park Mobile. Please don't, could be Passport Parking. There's so many of these I get names confused. But anyway, that back end office allows them to do enforcement. It gets the revenue, and there was no cost to the city to implement that program.
Mr. Pellet, did you have more information?
Good evening. I did just want to share that when we looked at implementing one of those apps, the issue was our fees downtown, that it was not cost effective for them to participate in the program with the city because our downtown parking fees were too low.
Okay. Question about the survey on essentially where you got the data on why people said they didn't use the decks. That was user volunteered. Do we have any objective survey information on the conditions of the decks? Cleanliness compared to the street, safety compared to the street, et cetera. Because I'm based on my personal experience of public decks, at least, and street conditions, they're just as clean and they're just as safe. And I suspect that a lot of that is user perception from folks who are not used to using decks, but I don't know.
A question that we asked in the survey that I thought was very telling, because, just some anecdotal people said, I don't feel safe in the deck. And we asked the question, comparing the deck to the rest of the downtown, do you feel less safe in the deck, the same, or more safe? And the vast majority was, it's the same as I feel in the rest of downtown. So that tells me there's not, we tried to capture, the comments. If we heard it more than once. So, I think
it's good feedback, but I think it's a question of interpreting the data.
Right, and that's why I think we included that question about how do you feel and compare the rest of downtown. And to me, that was kind of, and again, we're talking about 2 city decks and 3 or 4 private decks. So it's their perception of the deck they're in.
The other observation I had is that I think information availability is a key as well, because it's extremely rare that I can't find an on-street space at any time, including any of the peak periods, that I don't have to not walk any further than I would be walking from the nearest public deck. But I know where to go. And the casual user is the one, the occasional visitor is the one who doesn't know where to go. And they also don't necessarily know where the decks are.
Right, exactly.
But with that,
Yeah. Yes.
So, Mr. Chairman, if I'm understanding, it seems there's a consensus by the committee to be willing to consider staff bringing forward an item to look at the rates for on-street parking for your consideration.
There's certainly a consensus that we're willing to look at it, but when it comes down to actually increasing the rates, I suspect it will be a more intense debate.
Fair enough.
I'm ready.
We have to look at it.
Okay. Other questions or comments? If not, thank you very much. That concludes the planned agenda items. Mr. Turner, do we have anything else this evening?
No, but thank you for asking.
You're very welcome. In that case, seeing no one else jumping in, we are adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody.